You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio solo here for a short pod. We've got the bulk of our programming going on live today in Bloomington. Recording this at 9:30-ish on the morning of Saturday, February 8th. If you're going to be in Bloomington, we hope to see you later today. Hopefully you're getting a chance to listen to this. Maybe you're driving to the game. Maybe you're just hanging out at home. But I will be at the Upstairs Pub along with Scott from Crimson Cast during the game. We'll be talking about everything. And we'll also be kind of narrating the game, and we'll do a little bit of a halftime podcast. And then after the game at the Upstairs Pub, we'll have the assembly call crew. We'll have the doing the work crew, or at least part of them, and several other of our favorite folks from the Back Home Network, all at the Upstairs Pub. The event today, sponsored by Jack Fire Breakfast Club, going on as we speak. They had T-shirts. They've always got T-shirts. Crimson Cast will be selling some T-shirts today. If you want to pick up one of the iconic Bison tees, they'll be for sale. And we just would love to see you folks and chat about IU basketball. We've got a lot to talk about now. We were going to have a lot to talk about anyway, but maybe the tone a little bit milder than it might have been otherwise with the news that came out yesterday, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But hopefully you can join us at Upstairs Pub, the event sponsored by Jack Daniel's Fire, and we're really looking forward to being out there, so hopefully you will be able to join us as well. Also, a reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, our presenting sponsor, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. I also want to note, X's and Joe's will be at the Upstairs Pub as well. Apparently people in the audience think if I don't mention X's and Joe's, I might not like be on bad terms with them. Nonsense. We actually just had a great night with Bob and with Mike last night, and we went out and had some drinks at Nick's. It was a great time, and at least two people at the table were wearing Homefield Apparel, which is what made me think of that right there, including myself. So we're really excited about the new releases that Homefield Apparel's got coming out during the spring. They just released some Creighton apparel. There'll be more IU stuff, I think, on its way relatively soon. And of course, if you saw earlier this week, the Corso crew necks are out and they are delightful. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use the code HOME23, and you can get 15% off your first order. Also, check us out on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. Subscribing is free, and you get podcasts delivered right to your inbox. And follow us on YouTube, Back Home Network. Just search for it. Join the over 7,100 people who are in our YouTube subscriber list. All right, we got to talk about the big news. I've had people banging on the door asking, when are you guys going to podcast about Woodson? And Scott and I are going to have some extensive thoughts that we'll probably pod on Sunday about. So stay tuned for that. I want to get Scott's full thoughts on this. We've obviously been circling around this situation for quite a while, but wanted to get something briefly out before the festivities got started today and just talk a little bit about the sequencing of all of this and just what to think about everything, including how to think about the coaching search as it is now, I guess, underway. It's interesting because I think anybody who watched the Wisconsin game, you could see that opening was just kind of like the bad dream of the Louisville game come back to life again. And, Illinois game was the same way. It's just clear that this team and this coach were not on the same page, hadn't been really for the whole season. And, you go down the list of games this year that IU could point to as accomplishments. There's one, and it's the game at Ohio State, and it was a game that they almost blew. The rest of the season has just been really disappointing. They've beaten pretty much everybody that they should beat, and they've lost to pretty much everybody that you would have thought they would have lost to. And that follows a pattern that we saw last year where, you go down the list of games Indiana won and lost. You could point to the Wisconsin and Michigan State games at home as being perhaps, something small to get excited about. But it was a very similar pattern last year. Like, just go down the list. The best teams that Indiana beat is generally at Assembly Hall, and they just didn't do enough to compete for a tournament spot. And that was the trajectory this team was on this year. And it was getting ugly with Woodson being on the bench and fans getting more and more upset. And this is one of those situations where I think IU fans, there are certainly IU fans that don't behave well online. That's been the case ever since I've been online. I mean, I can still remember as a young, 15, 16-year-old in the very early days of the internet, hopping on what at the time were the Indie Star forums and just being like, my God, this is the IU fan base. And of course, it's just a small subset of the online fan base. But we were starting to see some spillover in terms of just people getting really frustrated, like otherwise very reasonable, normal people, just really done with this team, with this coach, with the way that the program has been run. And, this was a potential flashpoint this weekend with Dusty May coming back to town, having turned around Michigan, not into a national title contender, but turning them around quite a bit from what they were last year. And IU, despite all the promises that were made about a roster that was going to compete and potentially be able to win a Big Ten title or get to the Sweet 16 or beyond, clearly stuck in the mud. You've seen the empty seats if you've been to Assembly Hall this season, even in games against Big Ten opponents. You've felt the awkward energy. You've heard some of the booing. It's just not sustainable, and it's starting to spill over into players getting directly criticized and harassed. And whatever you want to say about how people conduct themselves, or whether that's just an unrepresentative group of a small number of people, the reality is it all still matters. And I think IU just found themselves in a position where, they needed to find a solution that tried to let Mike Woodson walk away with dignity, but also ensured that he realized he needed to walk away. And I think that that's really what happened over the last couple of days. A lot of rumors flying around during that whole process about what was going on. And, there were rumors Woodson was going to walk away immediately and not coach. There were rumors that, there was going to be some kind of an agreement or something announced on Thursday. And then, you got that weird leak at the end of the day that Pete Thamel had and Jeff Goodman had about there being, contemplations about whether Woodson was going to return. I think anybody who was paying any level of attention realized it was a flag saying, hey, we're almost ready to announce something. Please hold off for a little bit while we work out the details. Those things end up in the hands of media members that are kind of attached to traditional media outlets, let's put it that way, for a reason. And those sorts of announcements, or at least the intimation that there's going to be something or that there's thoughts happening, that's always something that lays the groundwork. Those things don't come out accidentally. And then yesterday, again, rumors back and forth. Yesterday, of course, being Friday, and then the culmination at 4:00 of a very interesting press release from Scott Dolson regarding Mike Woodson, which I thought tried to put as positive of a spin on the situation as possible, which is certainly understandable. Very much a call for unity as Indiana goes into this final stretch run of the season, 8 games remaining. And Indiana still with an outside chance of making the NCAA tournament. I know a lot of people laugh about that, but it's true. And, that is something to strive for regardless of what's going on. And yet I think there were IU fans that felt morally compelled to root against their own team on the off chance that if they did make the tournament, that I did it again. I did it in the last podcast too, that Mike Woodson, might be retained if they made the tournament. The reason I keep saying Mike Davis is this scenario happened almost exactly like this 19 years ago. I'm going to get to that in a second, but that's why that name keeps popping up for those who noticed it on the last podcast. I do think that it's very telling to me that the statement that came out was missing one thing that you would normally see in a statement of that type, which is any kind of quote from the coach. It's very, I'm not going to say it's rare, but in a case where a coach is voluntarily walking away, there's normally like a press conference, there's normally a statement of some sort that goes into the press release from the coach himself, like saying like, here's how it is. honored to have been the head coach at IU basketball. I regret it not working out. We hope to finish off the season strong. I do think it's really fascinating that did not occur, and I think it illustrates probably that this was not an easy last couple of days in Cook Hall or in the North End Zone facility at Memorial Stadium where the athletic offices are. I don't have any inside info on that. I haven't talked to anybody, but just you can read the tea leaves and you can kind of see this was not something that everybody was completely aligned with, I think. But it kind of doesn't matter. And if you recall, I think 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, we did a podcast where I talked about that particularly, and this idea that there was going to have to be some kind of a coming together of these two entities, of IU and Mike Woodson. Because Mike Woodson did not seem to think that, the struggles the team was having were enough to rise to the level where he might be fired. He certainly didn't seem like he was in any rush to walk away. And I think IU, understanding that you had a potential conflagration on your hands with the IU fan base getting increasingly frustrated about how the season is going and just being like, we got to find a solution to this. So we'll see how today goes. I'm really fascinated, especially with the lack of a statement from Woodson. I mean, does he do a post-game press conference? What is that like? What does he choose to say there? Woodson he's a proud man. He's a guy that, obviously he's been coaching in various capacities for a long time. And this is probably, I think in his mind, it's probably going to be the end of the road to some degree. I have a hard time seeing him being a head coach again. So I'm really curious to see what that reaction looks like. And, it's unfortunate that it had to end this way, but I do commend Woodson and IU for finally doing what needed to be done and realizing that this wasn't going to work out. And the longer it lingered, the worse it was going to get. And that's essentially where things are at right now. Obviously, I think we'll learn more about what happened with the process, both officially and unofficially, over the course of the next couple of weeks. But to some degree, I don't know that any of that matters at this point. What matters now is that Indiana is going to have to look forward and figure out what they're going to do with their head coaching position. I've seen this sentiment expressed in a bunch of different places, and I agree. This is a hire Indiana just simply, absolutely, positively cannot get wrong. You've had multiple hires now that have not worked out. Some of them were justifiable hires that were just things that didn't work. Others were hires that shouldn't have been made. And regardless of who was to blame or why things didn't work out with the previous hires, including the Mike Woodson hire, the reality is the Indiana basketball brand is pretty tarnished right now. And when you are looking at the results and you look at what IU has done over the course of the last really 20 years, it's a really, really barren cupboard. It's unfortunate in the extreme that IU basketball and the brand of IU basketball has deteriorated to the way that it has. And, one of the people we're going to talk about this whole situation, he wrote a really good piece on his, I think it was on actually the Assembly Call Substack, Tony Adranya, who I also had dinner with last night. We had a nice get together of the Back Home Network crew in Bloomington. But, Tony wrote a piece, which I want to go into depth with him about how at the end of the day, this has just been a series of bad hires. There's nothing structurally wrong with IU. It's an easy excuse that's made by people who are generally trying to find excuses for coaches that aren't getting it done at a particular level. And we've heard complaints, Tom Crean behind the scenes complained that IU was stuck in the past. And, Archie Miller, people blamed IU having too high of expectations. People have blamed that on Mike Woodson not being successful. It's all hogwash. I mean, IU is one of the most well-resourced programs in the country, and IU is a program that, for better or for worse, and I would actually, I think, argue for worse, hires coaches and honestly lets them do what they want, lets them create their own programs. Like this idea that there's all of these roadblocks to what coaches want or need to do, especially in this era where you can openly pay players, is pretty ludicrous as far as I'm concerned. Indiana's just made hires that haven't worked out at this level, and that's the simplest explanation. I know a lot of people want to throw a bunch of other things in there, but really it just comes down to that. You got to make the right hire, and you've got to make sure that that person has a vision, and you've got to make sure that that person can correctly and adequately describe what they're doing to a fan base that, isn't the hugest experts on basketball necessarily across the board, but it's a knowledgeable fan base that sees through teams that aren't playing hard or coaches that are devising schemes that aren't going to work in the long term. And, it's going to be a fascinating process. I've had a lot of people asking me, what do you think, who they're going to hire? I have no idea at this point. I do think it's going to be a search that will probably go in some unexpected directions. And I think ultimately when you look at the way that IU sits in the landscape, it's funny because we've already got the duality of the way the media, the college basketball media, love to talk about IU. In one breath, it's like IU fans have too high of standards, and they need to get over the fact that they're not an elite program anymore. They need to just settle for whatever. And then in the other breath, they're throwing, Bruce Pearl and Brad Stevens and Dusty May, who's the head coach of the Big Ten team, in the coaching hot boards that they're putting together. And it's funny because it's either a bad job or it's not a bad job. And every piece of evidence points to it being one of the best jobs in college basketball. It just hasn't been conducted particularly well. And I would just suggest to all of you, as you try to sift through what has been a truly stupid 24 hours of opening dialogue when it comes to the coaching search, don't fall into the trap of IU being, essentially irredeemable as a top basketball program in this era. All the pieces are there. And you got to keep in mind that a lot of the comments that come from especially national media when it comes to any basketball program, not just IU, come from coaches. Coaches are mostly interested in coaches. They're mostly interested in maintaining their own reputations. And as we've talked about on the show before, coaches love to blame factors beyond their coaching for their lack of success. And we've seen that at IU in both football and basketball over the course of the last several years. And then you bring, we always use IU football now as an example. You bring in Curt Cignetti. Suddenly all those excuses didn't matter. And Indiana was able to win very quickly with the right person in charge. And I think the same applies to IU basketball. I want to go back to something that I alluded to earlier, which I'm still chuckling about, which is mid-February has become kind of the era where IU has to kind of look itself in the mirror. I mentioned the Mike Davis resignation. It wasn't really a resignation. It was, well, you need to resign or you're going to be fired. We want you to let you go out on your own terms. That was a weird experience when that occurred. And I remember very clearly, I was at that Iowa game on a press pass of when the sports information office printed off a bunch of pages and ran through the press room 10 minutes before the game started, indicating that Mike Davis was sick and was not going to be coaching. I remember having a conversation with a student of mine at halftime who was working in the sports information office, and that student kind of letting me know, not actually sick. We're just not sure what's going on right now. And then the whole drama that plays out during that Penn State game where Seth Davis announces that Mike Davis isn't going to be coming back as head coach, Davis being all confused about it afterwards, and then the next day a press conference where Davis announces his resignation and gets to coach the rest of the season. And as many of you remember, back in 2006, that team rallied. They lost the next game against Illinois. They won their last 4 regular season games. They won a Big Ten tournament game, probably should have won another Big Ten tournament game, and then won a game in the NCAA tournament before losing to Gonzaga. That season had a positive ending, and the vibes were better because the pressure was lifted. And much like the current scenario, where I think there were a lot of IU fans that perhaps despite their normal attitudes were finding it very hard to root for this IU team because of the style, the way the team is played, and just the confusion that's been seen, and the idea that, well, gosh, if this team happens to put together enough wins to get to the tournament, does that mean another year of the Woodson era, which I think the vast majority of IU fans did not want. So maybe, and we saw that same thing in 2006. We saw that same thing where, Davis gets essentially forced to resign, and suddenly a lot of the pressures that existed around the IU basketball program melted away, and people felt a little more confident about saying, yeah, this is fine. We're going to try to root this team and this coach on because we know that it'll be over and we'll have a new coach in a month and a half. And that's what happened. Of course, that new coach ended up being Kelvin Sampson, which that you talk about a sliding doors moment there, but we can dive into that at another time. So just some thoughts, I guess, that I've had overall. I think that these are going to be some interesting days. Normally when a coach has gotten fired, when it happened with Archie, when it happened with Crean, we go on a bender here with podcasts where we're interviewing people left and right. Normally that's all happening really in a compressed time period because coaches have gotten fired like right before the NCAA tournament. And you've got about a week, maybe two, before a new coach gets hired. We're going to play it a little bit differently on Crimson Cast this time. I still want to bring all the stakeholders back. It's basically getting the conclave together again, getting some of our favorite voices, many of whom we haven't talked with in a while about IU basketball. Now that the pressure's off and we know there's going to be a change, and getting some thoughts about where IU basketball's at right now and where it might be headed, where it should head, and who might be the new head coach and what that means for the disposition of the program. So all that coming up, and hopefully you can join us at the Upstairs Pub. We'll start that process today as we talk about IU basketball, and hopefully IU able to go out and beat Michigan and get themselves back on the right track after losing 6 out of their last 7 games. It's a winnable game. It's a Michigan team that doesn't play particularly well on the road. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens with all that. But anyway, join us at the Upstairs Pub later on today, as I'll be there with Scott, and then I'll be there with Coach Tonsoni and Ryan Phillips. Kathy Amos will be there, Mike Weemuth, Bob Moats, Tony Adrania. We'll have the whole crew out there. I'm Galen Clabby. This is Crimson Cast. Thanks for listening. Have a safe drive if you're coming to Bloomington. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.